This series is part of the American Political Science Association's MENA program and is organized with support from Carnegie Corporation of New York. Thanks to everyone on the call for taking time out of your day to participate in the discussion. Now, given the continued uncertainty around global travel restrictions, the spread of new COVID-19 variants, and related economic challenges, we wanted to take a moment to revisit some of the questions about how to engage in fieldwork in MENA political science research. To be sure, questions about research design and methodology, access, and ethics are issues that scholars must grapple with even beyond the current moment we're living in. I'm very pleased that over the past week, we've been able to convene a series of conversations about specific methodologies in MENA political science and about fieldwork in general. We've had 13 experts from across the region, the US and Canada, leading these discussions. All of the sessions are free to attend, so if you enjoyed today's conversation, I encourage you to register for the final one, which will take place on Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern. For today, I'm so pleased that Dr. Jeffrey Karam and Dr. Peter Krause have agreed to facilitate this discussion on archival research. I know some of you are already familiar with their work, and I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves in just a minute. But before I do that, I'd like to share a few reminders about how we'll conduct today's session. Throughout the discussion, we welcome you to ask questions in the chat, share links and resources, etc. We definitely want this to be a collaborative discussion. My colleague Laura and I will help to moderate questions. And with this many people, I think it's best to ask your questions in the chat, and then we can call on you for clarification if need be. Please note that we are recording the session, and we hope to make it available on our website for future use. With that, I'll turn it over to Jeffrey and Peter to introduce themselves and begin the session. Thank you.
Thank you so
Peter.
much. Yes, thank you so much, APSA and APSA MENA and Andrew and Laura for inviting Jeffrey and I here. We're really excited to help to lead this session, this discussion today. As Jeffrey will talk about in just a moment, we have a lot of different sections to today. So we're both going to be doing presentations about working in the archives and about our own research, but we also really look forward to hearing from each of you about the research projects that either you're currently undertaking or that you're thinking about undertaking in or about the Middle East. And so we wanted to start today just with some basic introductions. So I'm Peter Krause. I'm an associate professor of political science at Boston College and a research affiliate in the MIT Security Studies program. I've done research in and around the Middle East for about a decade and a half now. A lot of my research focuses on Israel-Palestine, but I've also done fieldwork in Algeria, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, and then about the Middle East, but in a number of the archives in Europe, which we'll talk about today. Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. So I'm Jeffrey Karam. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the Lebanese American University in Lebanon. And I'm also a non-resident research associate at the Harvard University's Middle East Initiative. My research focuses on revolutionary processes, US foreign policy, and US intelligence in the Middle East. My archival work is between the Middle East, obviously, and America. And I've also done work in London, I've done work in Amman, I've done work in Beirut, and I'll be happy to talk today more with you about some of the problems that I encountered in our work. Peter is going to be doing the same thing, but again, as Peter mentioned, we want to echo that the most important part is that we're going to hear more about your research and be able to have a discussion about how you're thinking about archives during COVID and beyond COVID, and I look forward to beginning.
Wonderful. So we actually want to start with a quick little exercise. There's enough of us that I think it'll take a little too long if we all talk personally, but what I would love is, could everybody in the chat just write the following thing? You can just say your name, where you're coming from, if you want to say academic affiliation or where you're living at the moment, and then maybe just a sentence or so about why you're here today. Could be a sentence about a project you're working on, or a question or a topic that you want to learn about. But if everybody could type that in the chat, that would be wonderful. Jeffrey and I will kind of scan, we'll chat about them for a moment, and then we'll get into our presentations for today. So please, everybody type a little in the chat so we can learn about you right at the outset, and then we'll get going. Wonderful, Regine. Welcome. I also work on political violence in Middle East and North Africa. So we'll talk some about that today in terms of my background. And then Jeff also has done work on political violence. Although, Jeff, I feel like you're more kind of state to state and I'm more non-state, although I think maybe we do a bit of both. Okay.
Thanks. History in the region, that's amazing. When I see the word history in any discussion of political science, it's always a nice thing to feel and see. So that's great.
Yeah, I think we'll talk a little bit about that today. I mean, I'm someone, I don't know about your background, Jeffrey, but I actually did my undergrad in history and political science. And I did my thesis in history. So I was originally kind of trained as a historian. And I still find as a political scientist, I love history and I love the work of historians. Sometimes I'm not sure the love goes the other way as equally. I think that sometimes historians look at political scientists a little warily about how we deal with history. But we'll talk about that today. And anyone working on archival research learns a lot from historian and historical methodological articles and books, and we'll suggest some of those.
It's really how methods cross over, possibilities. Yes, Andrew, exactly. That's something we're going to cover. Judicial archives, Dawha Institute in Lebanon, working on a project on Iranian soft power. That's where also we're going to talk about issues of access when it comes to different archives, how we compare that in the region to other places. So that's also important. Elite networking. Yes, Omar, this is also interesting.
Yeah, and I'm seeing, with Hussein and Yasser and some others, master students. This is wonderful. I didn't get any of this type of training, before I went to my PhD program in this way. So that's wonderful you're here. Will hopefully give you some ideas today about how to approach archival research, thinking about logistics, thinking about ethical issues, thinking about access. So that's wonderful that you're here today.
And I'm happy that Hussein is here on a personal note, because Hussein is also my student at LEU. So Hussein, thank you for making it. I got a private message, but I think I can share this. Saidi is from Iran, living in Germany, and wants to write about the impact of climate change on irregular migration from Afghanistan. Really important to think about space, temporal boundaries, transnationalism. So, wow.
Excellent. Yeah, and I see Rosalie's point here about institutional autonomy of intelligence services. That's a fascinating topic. I'll be interested to know what documents and archives are available on that one. Jeff, you're doing a little more intel stuff. I do kind of declassified stuff sometimes from colonial sources, but intelligence services, that's a fascinating topic. I hope there's going to be good documentary evidence available.
So I think as you're flowing in, we can begin if you want, and just make sure that you're going to keep this flowing in. We're going to have, I'll talk more about this in a bit, but we're going to have like Q&A sessions at the end of the presentation. So when we say the word presentation, don't take it as a class, just take it as we're putting out some thoughts that are not structured. They're going to be structured because they're on PowerPoint, but they're not structured, but more of reflections of what we've seen, what we've experienced. And then we're going to be talking more about our research. So on that note, let me share screen and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, and let me just add real quick, Jeffrey, too, for everybody, everyone's probably like a Zoom champion at this point, but at any point, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, I believe, here, and Jeffrey and I will try to take those. Not just, we have a separate Q&A at the end of each of these presentations, but throughout, I'm sure Jeffrey would say the same. You can raise your hand and we're happy to engage if you have a question or a comment on the stuff that we raise as it comes up.
Wonderful. So the outline for today is going to be, we're going to proceed in the following way. So I'm going to begin with a very broad discussion of what we mean by archives, and I have some pinpointed answers and reflections on what, where, why, who, when, and how, and then a brief discussion of some problems. And as my colleague Peter just mentioned, if there's any part that you want to ask a question about or you want to get more clarifications about, please feel free to raise your hand. Again, these are not meant to be structured as a lecture or a presentation, but they're more structured from real lived experience when it comes to doing archival work in and from the Middle East, in North America, and in places in Europe. After I'm done with that section, Peter is also going to add a few of his own reflections. We'll have a quick Q&A, and then we're going to dig deep into real world examples from our own work. So Peter is going to talk about his own work, then we'll have a Q&A. I'll talk about my own work, then we'll have a Q&A. And if we feel that we all are in need of a short break to grab a glass of water or do something, we might go for it. But if the momentum is strong and we're happy to continue, we can just push through and have a wider and detailed discussion of your research project. So let's begin with the obvious question and if you want, the $1 million question for today. So just in the chat very quickly, if I just were to ask you what are archives, what would you say? If you were able to answer this in one sentence, what would you write? And please do that in the chat box. I love to collect your answers and we can talk more about them later on, but what do you think are archives? What are archives to you? We hear this word a lot in the Middle East, elsewhere, archive, right? We use it in Arabic as the word archive. So what do you think about what are archives? And I'm looking forward to seeing some responses in the chat window of what you would define as an archive. Collection of historical documents, records, okay. Historical records, okay. Other thoughts like magazines, newspaper clippings, YouTube videos. If I'm gathering YouTube videos right now, does that make an archive? Written, oral, visual recordings of events, oral histories. Great, that's something we can begin from. Wonderful. So when we're talking about archives, let's go with the basics. And really the basics focus on records and papers that are created by organizations and individuals in real time. And that real time aspect is very important. I'm going to be highlighting that several times because we're talking about the conduct of affairs happening in foresight, and we're looking at these documents in hindsight. What's important to keep in mind is that there are so many definitions of what we mean by archives, but for our purposes, and if we're going to think about it from a social science perspective, it's important to keep in mind that we're talking mostly about public, state-owned government records or private family records and institutional ones. What's important to keep in mind here is that when we are archivists ourselves, when we are preserving records, we don't know the actual value that is contained in this information until after the fact. So it's very important to keep in mind that value is such a subjective measure here, that we give value to these documents at a distance, and obviously after these events occur. So if one is gathering information right now, for instance, if you're observing what's going on between Palestine and Israel, or what's going on in Lebanon, or what's going on in Tunisia, or going on in Libya, it becomes very difficult to think that if you're just gathering small posters and clippings from here and there, are they going to have any intrinsic value 10 years from now? What's important to keep in mind is that many, and most archival records are unpublished materials that accumulate and grow over time. And this is something maybe we're doing already without even thinking about it, saving newspapers, family photos, posters, and flyers. From a research standpoint, we usually talk about archival resources as records and manuscripts. And we're talking about records. This could be anything related to documents, papers, blueprints, and other sources, government sources, business documents, or actual manuscripts where you can see undated, unpublished, large historical accounts, memoirs, or the personal records of individuals and influential families. And this could be your own archive, this could be your own lineage, or your own drawing, basically a larger framework of documents that you want to talk about and that you want to engage with. So the second question that we want to focus on, where can we find archives? And the easiest answer is really at university libraries. Other places, government and states. These are personal photographs that I've taken from my visits, repeated visits to London, College Park, and DC, to different archival sources. We can think about international organizations. Many of them are digitized, so this is very important. We'll be talking more about that in a bit. We can talk about religious institutions. We can think about the Vatican. We can think about Al-Azhar. There are so many places to think about in terms of institutions, museums. This is a personal photo from the British Museum, very important. You'd be quite surprised that many museums host records and archival documents that may not be really interesting for particular projects, but once one gets access of finding aids, you become quite surprised how much information could be stored in places that are somewhat odd to be hosting, for instance, documents related to security or documents related to foreign policy decision-making. A very important source, whether it's during COVID or before COVID or after COVID, really has to do with personal collections. And there is a growing tendency that I want us to highlight and be able to talk about in a bit that has to do with the idea of digitizing many existing archival sources. This is one of the sources that I use a lot, and I would encourage anyone that wants to write about issues related to security, issues related to military coups or revolutions in the Middle East, at least between the 1942-43 period and the 1982-83 period, which we're talking here about 4 decades, to check these excellent resources, which are hosted by the Wilson Center and available to you, whether it's during COVID or not. And online sources have become the new way of thinking about digital archives, whether it's the National Security Archive, the Foreign Relations of the United States, and we can go more and more about examples when we get to the point where we're going to be covering more and discussing more your research projects. So some highlights, I'm not going to go over them, but why do we need archives, right? We answered the what are they, where can you find them, but why do we need them? And in reality, there are so many reasons. These are just some of the reflections that I've actually been able to figure out as I was doing my research. And these are takeaways that I constantly get reminded about when I'm doing archival research. So the most important part I would say is that we care about having a first-hand access to these accounts in hindsight. So I'm not really interested, for example, as researchers, we are interested in getting as close as possible to a certain event and how it occurred. So there's always this notion of, I don't want to read how others have reflected on that moment. I want to try to the extent possible to get close to that event. And this has to do with the fact of why we do research, whether it's to refine existing scholarship, to refute what we think are poor accounts, or really to provide novel accounts. And this is where we can talk more about theory testing or theory building. But the most important part that we want to keep in mind here is that there is an element of creating less biased accounts. And it's important because it does serve as a gateway to the past, and in many cases can help us fill in important gaps that could be left understudied or not fully accounted for because of several limitations, which we'll be talking about more in a bit. And just to give you an example, like how would it be different to think about a study of revolutions or uprisings of the Arab world if we don't really engage in field work and engage in archival research? How different would it be to write about the beginning of the Arab uprisings in Tunisia, the self-immolation of Abu Ali, and what that means, Abu Azizi, I mean, sorry, and what that means in reality for our purposes, to be able to look at oral history accounts, look at newspaper clippings that were being written and published in real time between December 2010 and February 2011. So if you just think about that for a moment as a very broad example, it becomes very difficult to be able to say, I'm just going to observe what's going on in Tunisia and not be able to have access to some oral accounts or first-hand accounts or eyewitness accounts. The question that I want to move on to right now is like, who can use archives? And this is obviously the answer is in brief, anyone. But for our purposes, I would say that some of what motivates me to think about why I should be using archives really has to do with the fact that I've always found missing answers in secondary accounts. I'm not saying all secondary accounts have missing answers, but there are topics that you need to have that proximity to the actual subject or unit of analysis that you're using to be able to make a better and more holistic overview of a certain issue. I'm very interested in decision-making processes, and I cannot but think about how to connect the dots between intelligence, between security services, between diplomats, when it comes to decisions of US foreign policy in the region. Another important element has to do with how institutions change, whether they evolve, whether they devolve over time. And the last thing that I want to mention is that I've met so many individuals at different archives, just being there, conducting research for personal reasons. And when I say personal reasons, trying to like draw their family tree, trying to forge some lineage when it comes to their family history. So what I'm trying to mention here and discuss here really has to do with the fact that the causal linkages that we're trying to build between the past and the present could really begin with research, but could also include other aspects as well. The golden question that I always debate with many scholars is, when can we use archives? And this is really something that I know Peter and I are going to be talking about it. And it's good that we might have different opinions, and we want to hear your opinions as well about it. So obviously there is no perfect way of when to use archives. Some would advocate for the idea of that at the beginning of the research process. So before, as you're writing your proposal, it's important to know, based on those before you and as you're writing up and preparing for your literature review, to know whether archival research is something that you have to do. So that's at the very beginning. In some cases, it happens in the middle of the process. As you're writing, you realize that some voices are missing. These voices could be related to important actors or other junctures that are missing. And in some cases, and this happens, it becomes an afterthought. You're done with the research, you're done with the writing, maybe your manuscript is almost done, your dissertation is almost done, and you realize that there are some missing leads that you want to pick up on. But the idea that you want to keep in mind is, well, the golden question is, what is missing or different in existing scholarship? So you're not beginning in vacuum. And I would encourage everyone, not only because we're still living the effects of COVID-19, but the fact of cutting time and knowing what to focus on when you're actually doing research in the field is to keep in mind that you can begin from those before you. And that's something that I learned the hard way when I was thinking about my own topic, thinking, well, what's really available out there? And in some places, I ended up doing some short trips that were not that essential. So begin the journey and begin the hunting process by knowing, really making sure that you've covered and you've really explored everything before you when it comes to knowing whether these records are available or not. And sometimes I found buried down in endnotes or in footnotes, something like these documents are burned, or these documents are no longer available, or these documents, I got this copy from that person, but that person, we don't know where the copies are right now. So even if I were to make a trip, and this happened when I was conducting research on the free officers in Jordan, and the actual person had the archive, it was one person that everyone was citing. When I went to Amman, I thought that I was going to be able to get access to it. So I spent a couple of weeks there, and then I realized that if I had done my research more closely, I did realize that that archive, particular archive, is with one person that's in New York. And that could have saved me the trip from Boston to New York, then going from Boston to Amman at that point in time. Some differences that Peter and I were talking about earlier on when we were talking about political science and historians, what's important for our perspective is that we like archival research. And when I say we, I mean political scientists, because we're trying to flesh out, trying to test, trying to debunk, or trying to build new theories that are based on important political occurrences or events that are occurring. And we care about finding the smoking gun argument to be able to confirm or refute certain hypotheses. And there is a very fine line between what we do and how historians approach it. And I agree with Peter in what he mentioned earlier on, is that in many cases, historians are looking at the value of the records, why they're stored in a particular way, and why they're trying to provide the understanding of certain events. They're not really interested, like we do in political science, to fill in certain gaps as much as most historians would care to provide a more holistic account of moments in the past. And this is where interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity is key, because it helps us really try to think whether these silos do actually matter, do they actually mean anything, or whether we should be sticking to the idea that we should be very subjective or selective about our archival resources and what we can do with the data. And that's something we can talk more about in the Q&A later on. So how can we use archives? And again, these are based on experience that I've done. And this is something that could be revised and rewritten, and I'll be happy to talk more about practical examples. And I know Peter is going to do that as well. So begin with consulting by bibliographies, try to contact experts in the field. This is the number one advice that I got when I was graduate school. Don't be afraid to contact names that you find in the field that have done this research before you. They might be willing, in many cases, to share, and that might really help you with saving time and saving some of the trips that you don't have to do. The most important part is just make sure before you do any trip, as terms of an early preparation kind of method, is to ensure whether these records that you're looking for are digitized, which is going to save you tremendous time, or are they still in physical format. And your librarian at your university is supposedly one of your best friends when it comes to inquiring about existing networks and arrangements. I had a lot of help in America from different organizations that had these networks, and they were able to exchange documents, exchange microfilms that were extremely essential and useful, which saved me a lot of trips. So I would encourage you all to build this relationship, if you can, with your own library before you go out into the field. When you're going to begin the research, hopefully, and I say this hopefully because this is also varies across the board, finding aids are something that we love, and we find them in most Western archival locations. I wouldn't say the same thing about most archives in the Middle East, to be quite honest. It's been very difficult, and this is something that varies across the board. So you can find finding aids in Lebanon, for example. You can find some in Jordan. You can find some in Turkey, but that doesn't mean it's consistent across the board, or it's really updated, or it's really cataloged in a way that would allow you to save time and know that on my first trip, I'm going to do box 1 to box 14. On my second trip, I'm going to do box 15 to box 70. In most cases, these are constantly being changed in many archives around the Middle East and North Africa, but that's something we can talk more about. And again, if you want to build a circle of best friends, another best friend would be the person that you met there, an archivist in one of these sources, because they happen to be the gatekeepers of knowledge. And when I say gatekeeper of knowledge, they can make your life easy, right? By telling you, for instance, you can come at 8 a.m. in the morning and it's fine if you leave at 4 p.m. Or they're going to tell you, I'm going to go for a lunch break that's going to take me over 3 hours and a half. And I actually have examples from both cases, and that could derail you a lot. And I'm not talking about this, whether this is only something that happens in North America or something that happens in the Middle East. But given our focus on the Middle East, this is a part that you need to keep in mind, the hidden side of archival research, which is how to cozy up to these individuals. Funding your trips, getting money, that's going to be very important. How can you go do that? And obviously, these are just recommendations that you can think of. I've used all of them and they've worked so far. A smartphone, Google Drive, iCloud for space, software for digitizing documents. This is really going to help you later on if you're able to get this kind of software. Google Drive does that for free. Just as a tip to everyone, you can throw images on a Google Drive and it does OCR on them. So you can use your text, but you cannot download them. So that's a small trade-off. Plan your trip realistically. Like I get emails from colleagues in the US when they want to visit Lebanon. Like, we're coming over Christmas vacation, and it's often 2 or 3 people are going to be anywhere around Beirut during Christmas vacation. So that's, for example, one of those small caveats that you need to keep in mind. And make sure that you are following the different rules and regulations. I asked a few questions in Amman about Black September, right, that were not really taken in such a good way, right? And these were just broad questions about what's available in terms of documents. And so it's always good to have some kind of guide ahead of time to be able to know what are some of the rules and regulations beyond ones that are posted at the actual archive, right? And this is something that we can talk more about. And I hope you have questions about this in the Q&A, because Peter and I, from our positionality, we approach different and similar archives from different standpoints, right? So it's great to talk about our experiences. Peter might have had more access to things in Lebanon than I might have had in Lebanon, right? And this has to do with the fact that I'm Lebanese. What does that mean? Do I belong to a certain group or not? Which is not the same case for other scholars. And that's something that we can talk about in a bit if you want. Planning and executing your trip. So I would always go for the rule of 3, which is idealistic, realistic, and actual. So I always have this plan. I'm going to go create the entire archive, right? I'm going to go, and this happened literally in 2016. I went to the CIA Crest archives in Maryland. It's a very small room, 4 computers. Most of the time, the printers are not working. You have to look for someone to get you toner, and that's at 1 p.m. So if you're there at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., you have to wait for hours for someone to get you ink. And then CIA decides to dump all the records online in 2017, just to give you an example. So the labor that I did for 4 months ended up with 1 click being all posted online. So my idealistic version going there was that I'm going to recreate that entire archive and print them out and bring 2 bags of actual paper, because you can't use the USB, you can't use the camera, you can only print in the actual FOIA electronic reading room at Maryland. So imagine that for a moment, 4 computers, more than 8 people working there, so we're taking turns. And then I realized, well, basically this wasn't a realistic plan or an actual plan. The actual plan was 25 kilos of paper, which is not really nice to drag around from Maryland to Boston. And then a couple of months later, these records were online. So there are mixed opinions about recreating files as is, going to the archive and being a machine about it, opening up every single file and taking every single photograph and uploading it, or being very selective and basically making good time of how you analyze. As a graduate student versus a faculty member versus a postdoc versus a graduate student, these are different considerations, right? But the idea comes down to how you would think this is going to be better for you. Are you going to read 10,000 pages later? And I'll tell you a small note bene, and Peter and I were laughing about this the other day. I have enough records for my book manuscript that I haven't been able to look at. So I have more than enough from all these trips, and I'll finish my book, I'll publish my book, and I still have records that I have not read closely. So sometimes we underestimate the power of how much is out there, right? When it comes to photographs, when it comes to organization. So keep that in mind. And the golden rule is really to back up your work as fast as you can. After your trip, and I'm going to start to sum up right now, after your trip, just keep in mind that an email to thank an archivist goes a long way, goes really a long way, thanking someone, right? Just saying thank you for, maybe they did one small thing, which is provide you with a pencil, because you're not allowed to take in a pencil. Maybe they provided you with a folder that you needed, right? But the idea is that there have been often cases where one person was able to go in and say, well, oh, those documents were misplaced, and here they are, right? So that person is really someone that I want to keep on my list, right? A check-in list, a touch base list. So keep that in mind. And this might sound like a cliche, but please do a scan of all your documents, store them with a cousin or friend. And I also have like a hard disk, a backup, and I use the cloud, because sometimes these archives might get shut. Something might happen where there might be a moment of crisis and you cannot no longer access them. So start as soon as possible to guard against that. I'm not going to cover the analysis and writing part, because I know there was a MENA workshop on text analysis, But depending on your topic, it's going to be very important. And I know, Andrew, later on, you're going to get a link to all of this. So I'm not going to go into this, but the idea of turning text into data using SPSS, data R, or free software to draw connections and relationships between words, frequencies, networks, mapping are all important ways of thinking about archives. And I'm happy to talk more about what I've done in my own work and what I'm doing right now on this issue. So problems, time consuming, obviously, what to pick on. Are we going to be motivated? Is there a motivated bias in a way? We're choosing what we want out of a huge treasure trove of documents. Are we all limited when it comes to processing thousands of pages? Do we have resources to afford to spend a semester in an archive or a month in an archive? Getting lost in the details, and what do you do with missing or redacted information? And in my case, because I work on intelligence and foreign policy, I often see many documents like this. This is a joke from Twitter, right? But these are two actual documents. And in many cases, I get this smoking gun document, just 25 pages online as a finding aid. I click on it. There's like one word that says Lebanon, right? Or Jordan. And then, okay, then there's like 25 pages and page denied. And we can talk more about that and how to circumvent it and what to do with oral histories and other strategies. But for people writing about security, and some of you are, or thinking about these foreign policy questions, when it comes to diplomacy, you're always going to encounter missing documents, and you just live with it, right? You do a FOIA request, maybe your first book, second book, third book is done. The FOIA request is nowhere to be found, but at least there is the possibility of doing something like that. Some problems when it comes to the MENA, the definition of an archival document, as we began in the session earlier on, is really all over across the board. Is it oral history? Is it personal statements, speeches? Are these stolen records, classified information? It's very hard to find one definition of what an archival document is, mostly in the Middle East and North Africa. Governments are still in control. Mostly, I'm not going to go into types of governance in terms of saying, is it better to be in democracy or an authoritarian regime? You know the obvious answer, but the idea is that states are gatekeepers as well when it comes to providing access to certain documents. And in many cases, these documents really have to do with the fact maybe they're not there, maybe they were stored poorly, or maybe these documents should not see the light of day. And I'll give you a small example. After the August explosion in Lebanon, the August 4 explosion in Lebanon, a very big chunk of what is considered to be Lebanon's national archives was demolished at the port of Beirut, right? We don't talk about it, but in reality, that's a very big chunk of whatever archival sources we had that right now has been destroyed. And many documents, you'll be quite surprised, in many parts of the Middle East, at least where I've done work in the Levant, have really become personal records, not state government records. So they're actual state records. They're like military reports, or they're anything that has to do with diplomatic reports, but they have become personal records due to changes in governance, moments of occupation, actual civil wars. And in Lebanon, after doing a lot of work in Lebanon, it becomes very clear that many of these important political party archives are owned by one person. It's one individual that actually has them in their summer house or somewhere, and your access to what is an archive becomes that personal relationship with that individual. COVID-19 and other moments of crisis, inability to travel, obviously we discussed that. The temporary closure of institutions, what can we do? I'll give you an example of Lebanon. That was even before COVID. Several colleagues were in Lebanon in September and planning to stay till November to do research. Then we had the beginning of the October uprising, so that led to roadblocks, universities shutting down, archives not being accessible, no public servants working anymore or any civil servants, so that actually delayed their entire work for a couple of months. Documents can be removed, or there might be lack of access because over email, maybe sometimes individuals that you're chatting with can be very friendly, but in person, they might feel that there's something about you that doesn't click, so they can decide that they don't want to share these documents. And I've had that happen to me twice. And on those both occasions, it wasn't really clear that you're writing about security. You told us you're writing more about foreign policy. And I said, well, they're intertwined to a certain extent, and they didn't like that notion. And the notion of security services in the MENA sounds different than security services in somewhere in College Park or somewhere in Q. So important takeaways, like I just want to be clear about one important thing from the very beginning, and we can talk more about this, is that in reality, we have an abundance of records before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. And if there's one thing that we learned about this sort of work during COVID-19 is that there's so much out there to process that it will take us decades to be able to do it. So the argument that we always have to be physically in a location is important, but that should not dissuade you from beginning somewhere. really looking at what's available out there in reality. And I love the approaches that actually materialize on Twitter and elsewhere between scholars creating digital platforms. And I invite you all to check out these digital archives. Some of them are under hashtag academic Twitter, some of them are under hashtag archives. But the idea is that many scholars decided to pull in their resources together and share documents because they can't make these actual trips. Establish contact, push yourself to talk with individuals that have actually done the work before you. In many cases, they're going to be more than friendly, and they can really make your life much easier than you can imagine. Keep a good relationship with gatekeepers. Archives are really fun. They're really useful. There's always going to be problems with funding and time to sift through all the pages and issues of redaction. But if your goal is to provide something new, refine existing scholarship, it's going to be important to think at least whether your work in any shape or form could benefit from such archival research. Skills, whether you're using archives or not for research and writing when it comes to organization, is going to be very important. And my important sort of takeaway is that once I'm feeling that I'm getting too close to my subject, I like to go back to the archives to be able to refine my own motivated bias, because there is an element of subjectivity, why I'm choosing certain records, certain documents, and certain locations. So I'm going to stop there. And I know, Peter, you want to add a few things, and then we can take it from there. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey, for that really excellent introductory presentation about archives. So many great things there. I'll just say a couple quick points to co-sign some of the things you brought up and raise a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to everybody here. So first, just co-sign the fact that you said, some archives don't have finding aids, but I think, implicitly you are saying something else, which is, archivists are the finding aid everywhere. And that's certainly what I found in my experience. So befriending those individuals, they're the ones who have the deep knowledge of what documents are available and what's there. So I don't think that you could have a better piece of advice than that. Your points on contingency planning I thought were great, especially amidst COVID-19. Even in the best of times, exactly the access you want to exactly the documents you're hoping to find, exactly the time you have is probably not going to happen. But especially right now when there's so much uncertainty about just access to a country, let alone access to an archive, building in contingency to everyone's research project is just a necessity these days. Okay, so 3 quick points in terms of like broader questions that you brought up that sparked some of my thinking. The first is, I think that I do interviews as well as archives. And I think with, those methods can actually inform your archival work. And here's what I mean. I think when people think about doing interviews, one of the obvious questions they come to right off the bat is, who should I talk to, right? Who are the people I would ideally like to talk to? And we think of documents sometimes as kind of, these dead letter things, but in a broader sense, it's also kind of like, who do I want to talk to or who do I want to hear from, right? Not just in terms of who is there, but different perspectives, right? So if I'm doing research, as I'm going to talk about today, about, the Algerian War of Independence, it's like I want to talk to or hear from both the French and the FLN and the MNA and these other groups. And so thinking holistically about who you want to hear from in an ideal world, I think is a good first cut. And then we get into, what's actually available, which is a second thing. But I thought you did a good job kind of bringing up some of those issues. In terms of history in the history field, I'd say this, as political scientists, we're spending a lot of time, not everybody, but many people are, a lot of time generating theory, right? You're trying to generate an original theory, original hypotheses about how the world works or what happened in a given case. And you're engaging with all this social science literature that may include everything from interviews to archival work to field experiments to whatever. So that takes a lot of your time, right? Just due to time alone, you can't then be an as in-depth historian as most historians are if you're going to do that other stuff. Now, again, there's many people in political science who do history work. Like one of the people I was trained by, Mark Trachtenberg, was pretty much a historian who's now in political science department, but he's a little bit more rare. So what that means is you can't necessarily spend 3 years in the archives, although some people do in some cases. But what I would say, though, is you should have an understanding of the historiography behind your cases, because that's how, in many ways, I think you do better work, but also you get respect from historians. Is like you don't necessarily have to spend the exact same amount of time doing all these things, but you need to have an understanding of the debates that exist about your cases. Because one of the hearings I hear, or things I remember from my history colleagues, is, we build these beautiful sculptures about a particular point in time or a particular era, and then social scientists want to use those sculptures as building blocks, for their theories. And, there's some problems there where you're sanding down the edges, or in really bad cases, you're ignoring nuance or details that maybe are important, but they don't fit your theory so well. So getting to Jeff's point of motivated bias. So at the very least, I think reading the historiographical record about your cases is a really important thing, even if you're going to leverage off of some of that, as well as doing some of your own primary work. And then the final thing, the question that you brought up, Jeff, which I hope we talk about, I'd love to hear from some people here right now about when to go to the archives in your research process. And I think you're right. Whether you're kind of doing more inductive or deductive analysis, more kind of interpretivist versus, positivist, all those things have an impact on when you go to the archives. For me, and as I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, I felt like I wanted to have a good understanding from the secondary source literature of those existing historiographical debates about the basics of kind of what had happened in the cases that I was looking at, having some of my idea of what the competing theories are that I'm going to try to analyze. And so I had my antenna up and my filters up for certain documents and certain things I was looking for. But I think also, just like when you're interviewing someone through semi-structured interviews or otherwise, being open to changing your ideas, not just about what happened, but about what's important and what questions you should be asking and how the actors who are involved are actually perceiving these things versus maybe how you, as an outsider or someone who's not alive during that time, is seeing them. I think that's incredibly important. And when I look not just at my own work, but many other people's work, and I read their acknowledgements or their preface or whatever, again and again, people will say things like, I went into the archives, thinking I would find this or looking for this, but then it changed my conception about what had happened or what was important. And those are often the best findings that you have as a researcher. And so I think that when people do interviews, they really understand that. I mean, this volume that Jeffrey mentioned, I was just involved in, like everybody in interviews talked about how they went into the field for a field experiment or talking to people thinking they were going to try to ask this question and then it changed. I think with archives, there's more of a sense that you don't have that, but I think that that's wrong if you feel that way. I think archives really do change your thinking. And so thinking about when the process you want to do it, sometimes it's at the very end, but then it changes your thinking. So is that really the end in terms of how you're actually doing the project? So I think not doing it before you've done anything, because then you don't even know which archive you're going to or which documents you're pulling, but kind of midstream. And having exploratory fieldwork is something we talk about. I think exploratory archival work can be useful. I know, Jeffrey, you mentioned, well, I did some initial little trips that didn't end up being that valuable, but you don't know if they're going to be that valuable at the time. And even if it's telling you don't want to go in this direction, right, that can be valuable. So anyway, I thought that was a great presentation. Those are some of my thoughts. Let's open it up to Q&A. So people who have a comment or question, we'd love to hear your opinions on these issues, can raise your hand electronically or otherwise. We'd also love to see you. So I know many people have their cameras off if because of Wi-Fi or how comfortable you are, that's fine. But if you want to ask a question, we'd love to see you if we could.
And we just want to stress again that both reflections that I presented right now and Peter added to are ones that we actually experience in the field when it comes to grappling these questions, right? Beginning of the process, middle of the process, or thinking about the value of these trips. So anything that you want to push us on and ask about in terms of practical takeaways, because after we're done with this Q&A, Peter is going to focus on his research and he's also going to talk about ups and downs. And I'm going to focus very briefly on my work. So we really want to get this out of the way, if you want, in terms of these unquestioned, I don't know, like these questions that you're not going to ask in another venue when it comes to archives. Maybe we don't have answers, but at least we have some answers to provide on maybe practical cases like, okay, what happens if your phone dies? They take with a power bank with you. Like I always take 2 power banks with me. Like this is like a small tip, but it helps you a long way when you're 7,000 miles away and you only have a limited amount of time. You need every single minute, for example, like time management. So anything that comes to mind, we're ready to field your questions and be able to chat about them as a group. So the floor is open. Please go for it.
Great. And I'll just add one other thing real quick because I saw we have a question in the chat. So yes, you can raise your hand and we're happy to have video discussion. If you want to put it in the chat, that's fine. I don't think this would be the case, but if possible, if anyone feels like they want to ask a question, but they want it to be anonymous because this is being recorded, you could write anonymous and ask the question, and Jeff and I won't name you. We'll just bring up the question. But I see Andrew has one here. I don't know, Jeffrey, if you want to go first. I have a thought on it, but go for it if you like.
Sure. I think the most important part about any collection, whether it's personal or institutional, really has to do with the body of work that you're doing and the questions that you're asking. So in my case, when I found out certain individuals that were very important in the puzzle that I'm looking at, right? A name that's mentioned somewhere, right? And that name is, I don't know, like let's say an arms dealer that was very important at the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War, right? And that name is mentioned several times. I can't find anything about that person. I tried to trace their family members to a certain extent and say, well, what can I know more about that person? This would sound like what a historian would be doing, but in reality, in political science, as Peter was mentioning, there was a puzzle that I wanted to really understand. So that person became a key unit of analysis in these actors to understand that moment in time. So the only way for me to know how important was to really meet with some family members and say, well, did he leave anything behind? In that case, this person I'm thinking of, did he leave any kind of trace that I can use that would allow me to understand where was he in these important moments, these important junctures? Like, was he really in Spain when this like arms deal occurred between 1973 and 1974? Do you have anything that could show that or discuss that? Because I've seen this footnote, and maybe this footnote has been recreated in 4 books, 8 articles, but I'm not really convinced. And that's where, for my work, that was like a great place where I really needed that personal collection of records and documents and newspaper clippings, and even sometimes visit the family home to get a vibe of some of the books that they read. And I'm not going to write about that, obviously, but it gives you a well-informed account of who you're dealing with. These are some thoughts.
Totally agree, and I'll add to that. So yeah, I mean, as Andrew's question is implying, when it's about an individual person that's not housed necessarily at an archive, it's a little bit more idiosyncratic. But I'll say this: first off, a lot of personal collections are housed at archives, right? So one of the most classic things you'll see is like so and so's personal letters, or so and so's. So oftentimes, especially after someone dies, a family might donate that person's personal letters, if he or she was an involved political activist or whatever, to some local archive or university, library, whatnot, that they trust or otherwise. But I'll say from my own experience, I've had a couple other scenarios that have also come up. So one that I'm going to talk about in just a moment is that when you're interviewing people, sometimes they might say, hey, I've got these documents, or, oh, I've got these letters, et cetera. And that's all idiosyncratic in terms of whether you have enough trust with that individual, whether you feel comfortable asking them if you could look at those things or otherwise. I remember talking to a colleague who was interviewing a woman who was a labor activist, and she had this book about all the various people who had joined the labor movement at various times and their, et cetera. So there was this incredibly valuable resource, but at the same time, you have to navigate the ethical challenges as well as the kind of personal relationships about whether that person will trust you with that. Because when it's not housed at an archive, which I guess we'll talk about, has its own procedures of who gets access, when it's with an individual, it's pretty much that person's the gatekeeper. And so as Jeff mentioned, even if you're someone who's saying, well, I'm not doing interviews, I'm just working at archives, you may have to do some interpersonal interaction with some of these individuals or their families if they have, personal letters or things of that nature. The other thing I'll add, it's not exactly personal letters, but as I'll talk about in a moment, I got access to someone's field notes. So there was an excellent researcher from MIT, we got his PhD at MIT, and he's a professor at UVA. His name is Bill Quant, and some of you may know him. And Bill Quant did excellent fieldwork in Algeria just a few years after the Algerian Revolution and War of Independence that ended in '62. And so he interviewed a ton of people that had died, of course, long before I went to Algeria, that I would have loved to have talked to. But then when I was working in one of the archives in Algeria, Bob Parks, who worked there, said, "Hey, we have Bill Quant's field notes." And I asked Bill, and Bill said, I could look at them. And so he basically had notes from all of these interviews he had done with people, and it was kind of his personal archive of his field research. And he asked many of the questions that I would have loved to have asked. And so a lot of that stuff is idiosyncratic. It's an individual, but if you're in the field and you're talking to people and you're talking to other researchers, Jeff mentioned this, but I mean, talking to other researchers who have worked on your issue or your case, that is the first stop you should go to, because those people will have a great idea about what's available and what's out there. They're gatekeepers in a way, because if they feel like you're serious and you're doing good work, they'll introduce you to people. And, as we all know, that can give you a better reputation or access with the people they introduce you to. So again, even though I keep bringing up the interview stuff, because even working in archives and getting access to them have a lot of similarities with how you do, whether snowball interviewing or talking to people and establishing trust in a network and a community. So I think that matters a lot for this personal collections question.
That's wonderful, Peter. So we're still waiting for other questions if you want, or we can proceed with Peter's presentation right now, and then you can think about other questions and write them up in the chat. So if you want, we can wait for a bit, or Peter, you can go ahead. So any other questions that we can tackle, discuss collectively, that would be great.
Yeah. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other hands for the moment, so I'll do my presentation, and then we'll have some more questions, discussion, and Jeff will say a few things, and then we're going to actually spend the last part hearing from you about some of your research projects and giving you some feedback and some discussion. So, okay, so what I'm going to do now, and Jeff's going to do as well, is going to present a bit on a particular project. So I think Jeffrey did an outstanding job of presenting in a broad sense. Here are archives, here's how you use them, here's some of the issues about it. But we all know that, that's good, but sometimes that abstract stuff doesn't resonate as much as this particular. And so Jeffrey and I are both going to talk about our particular research, how we use some of these lessons, the challenges that we face, because everything, of course, was not always perfect. And hopefully that will illustrate some of these issues and how you can do actual archival work in and about the Middle East. So let me pull up my presentation here. Okay, give me a thumbs up. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about my first book project. This is the book here, Rebel Power: Why National Movements Compete, Fight, and Win. This was my dissertation. So those of you who are in PhD programs and hoping that your dissertation will become your first book, that's the exact process that I'm talking about. So I'm going to be talking about doing field research and archival work in grad school as well as an assistant professor, because I continued to work on the book the first couple of years when I was at Boston College. So I'm just going to spend like 2 or 3 minutes giving you an overview of the questions I was asking in the book and the argument I had, going to what we were mentioning with Jeffrey before about how I didn't just dive into the archives until I knew the question I was asking and some of the arguments I wanted to analyze. But the majority of it, I'm going to talk about particular archives I went to and some of the challenges that I faced. So my book asked 2 questions, or my dissertation initially asked 2 questions. One is, why do some national movements succeed and others fail? So basically, we have, a couple hundred states in the world today. A majority of them are the result of national movements, of people saying we've got common language, history, culture. We want to have political autonomy or independence in a common piece of territory. But obviously some of those succeed, and then others to this point have not been successful. We can think about the Kurds, or to varying extent the Palestinians, which is one of the cases I looked at, who have not yet had kind of full sovereignty over a piece of territory the way they would like. The second question I asked is, why do the various organizations within these movements, and again, very few movements have a single organization. They often have multiple political parties or rebel groups or various other types of activists. Why do some of them opt to employ violence, whereas others deploy not violence or even restrain violence from the movement? And then secondly, why at various points are these organizations opting to negotiate with the state government that they're fighting against, whereas others are trying to spoil those negotiations? So I've got this kind of 2-tiered question of the success or failure of the movement, and then the behavior of the actors within the movement. And those are the questions I'm trying to ask. So in brief, I had a theoretical answer to both of them. The answer to success and failure is that I said, look, it has a lot to do, and you can see I have some background in IR as well as comparative, is that I kind of use the basic idea of like unipolarity, bipolarity, et cetera, or if you think in terms of economics, kind of a capitalist versus and free market versus a monopoly. And the idea was, hey, if you have a hegemonic movement, which is not just a single group, but a group that dominates other organizations in terms of its membership size, its money, its arms, etc., more than 3 times the size of the others, I would call it a hegemonic movement. And the argument was hegemonic movements are going to spend less time fighting amongst themselves. They're going to have a more clear and cohesive message to international supporters. They're going to be able to have a more cohesive strategy to fight against the state and negotiate credibly with it. Whereas if there's 2 or more significant groups, whether they're united or not, they're going to spend a lot of time internally competing. They're going to have mixed messages. One's going to negotiate while one is spoiling. And ultimately, it's going to be less successful. So that was the theory that I had. And then in terms of the argument about behavior, and again, there's a lot of detail on this slide, but I'll just say a couple of basic things. The argument was kind of like based on prospect theory. If you are the hegemon, or if you are leading a movement, the idea is you're going to be very risk averse, and you kind of want the game to end. So think about a game of musical chairs where the various rebel groups are walking around the throne, and what every group does is they want the music to stop when they're standing in front of the throne so they can become the new government, right? So the hegemon is basically in the catbird seat, saying that if we win at this point, if we all of a sudden get a negotiation or defeat the state, I'm now the dominant organization, so I'm probably going to become the new prime minister, the new leadership of the government, et cetera. So therefore, I'm both going to be striving for victory, and I'm going to somewhat tamp down on escalatory violence, because violence is a pretty risky thing that can kind of change the hierarchy of the movement. Whereas if I'm a weaker organization, I don't like my position in the hierarchy right now. If things end right now, if the music stops, I'm not going to be powerful. And so therefore, I'm not always going to turn to violence, but violence is going to be much more attractive because I'm risk acceptant, and violence can potentially shake up the game, get me some new recruits, get me some notoriety, maybe provoke a war in which the government is going to crack down on that top group instead of me, and so change the hierarchy. So that was also the theory that I was trying to look into. So I then turned to the empirics of it and said, oh, okay, I want to analyze this. Now, as I mentioned before, I was trained as a historian and much more of a qualitative researcher than quantitative, although in recent years I've done some experiments, I've done some statistical analysis, but it's not as much my bread and butter. And beyond that, I actually, given the theories that I had, didn't really have the choice to do kind of a large N analysis. Why? Because I'm doing this micro level claim about the strength of every single organization inside a national movement at every different point of time. And to this day, there is no data set that exists with reliable information about the membership size of every rebel organization at every point in time across all of these national movements. What there is great data sets on kind of data about the entire movement, and then some stuff about particular groups, but not necessarily year by year. And so that's what I really cared about. So I said, okay, I'm going to be digging in and creating or finding this information myself with a small number of cases. And so I picked these four. I picked the Palestinian national movement, the Zionist movement, the Algerian national movement, and the Irish national movement. And I picked this in first part because it had variation in the outcomes that I cared about, right? You have Algeria, which is a successful national movement, and the Zionist movement, successful. They both get a state pretty much along the lines of what they want. You have the Irish case, which is a mixed bag, where they get the Irish Free State and later the Republic, but they don't get Northern Ireland as part of it. And then you have the Palestinians, which to this point has not been a successful national movement. All that being said, there's also tremendous within case variation within each of these, right? So the Palestinians have had more or less success over time, as, by the way, did the Zionists and the Algerians, decades of failure before ultimate success. So I cared about it there. I cared about because there's multiple competing theories about these cases, about why groups were successful or not, or why behavior happened a certain way. I had some time and space variation here where I was looking at 3 cases within the Middle East, but 1 external case, as well as changes over multiple decades. And then ultimately, I'm someone who believes, yes, I do want to do good historical work. I want to do good political science work, but I also do care about engaging with the broader community of citizens, of scholars, of the policy community. So that also had some impact on my case selection as well. So what did I decide to then do? I said, okay, I have to get information on all these various nationalist organizations, their membership size, their funding levels, their armaments, and then also the reasoning behind their decisions about why they're using violence or not, why they're negotiating or not, their successes and failures. And so I decided to do kind of mixed methods in the sense of I wanted to interview people who were members of each of these organizations, oftentimes elites within the organizations who were there in the room when they were making decisions about negotiating, about escalating or de-escalating violence. But also I knew that I had to do a lot of archival work. So I did archival research in 6 different countries for this project. So I was at the Institute for Palestine Studies in Beirut. They also have a headquarters in DC, but that's when I was in Beirut and living in Hamra. I was spending time in the Archive National d'Outre-mer in Aix-en-Provence in France, because again, I was looking at the French archives about Algeria. I was at CIMA, the archive in Oran, so that's where one of the places where I was working with Bill Quant's documents, as well as some other documents. The British National Archives, which Jeffrey mentioned before, that are in London, the Public Records Office and Lynn Library up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and then a bunch of archives inside of Israel. A number of the different nationalist rebel organizations among the Zionists, the Haganah, the Palmach, etc., have their own archives in addition to the Central Zionist Archives. And so I spent a lot of time going to state archives, going to individual group archives, doing kind of local private stuff over a series of years. So again, just in brief, this is the field research I did for this book and this dissertation. And you can see I spent a lot of my early time when I was in Israel and the West Bank doing some exploratory work initially for a month or 2, but then spending, significant chunks of time, 5 or 6 or 7 months at a time, doing a combination of working in archives and doing interviews with members of these national movements. And for my dissertation, to be clear, I did not do all of this field work or go to all of these places. For my dissertation, I just did the field research for the Zionist movement and the Palestinian national movement. So the way I wrote it up was, in my dissertation, I had really good in-depth knowledge about the inner workings of these organizations, about their relative strength, relative success and failure over time. And then in my dissertation, I wrote up Algeria and Ireland as kind of more shadow cases where I had read the secondary source literature, but I had not yet done interviews and archives. And then I had a decision to make once I became a professor of saying, okay, do I want to just kind of get this book out there? I think it still would have been above the bar to be published at a university press, but it wouldn't have been the book I really wanted it to be, which is in-depth archival research and interviews for all of my 4 cases. And I decided, thankfully, being at BC, a school that gave me some good research support, but also was a school that was not requiring me to do, say, 2 books for tenure, just kind of 1 good book with some articles. I made the choice to then go back to the field in Algeria, Northern Ireland for multiple years to do the field work for that. So again, when you think about your dissertation project or your archival work, you don't have to think about getting everything done for your dissertation. You want to think about certain things and think about the project maybe in longer term, depending on what your needs are for publication, for jobs, etc. One other key point I wanted to bring up here about affiliation, because you can see I have some affiliations here. That's a tough one sometimes, because when you affiliate with a university or with a center, it can open some doors, but it can also close some doors, because obviously, as you know, with Middle East politics, especially Jeffrey was mentioning in Lebanon, there's tension, there's political tension like there are in any society, just like in the United States today, right? And so I made a lot of decisions about, do I want to affiliate here? And my affiliation choices were not just based on research. I'm someone who is trying to be a teacher of Middle East politics to understand various perspectives on this stuff. So I would affiliate with places that sometimes, to be honest, I didn't necessarily agree with the politics of the individuals who were working there or otherwise, but I wanted to learn about the research they were doing. And then in some cases I was affiliating because it would help me to, get access to the country or the people I'm working there with. So for example, access to Algeria, I could not have done that by myself. I was lucky enough to meet with Bob Parks and, I think it was at ISA, and talked about the research I wanted to do in Algeria. And he walked me through the process of how to get a visa to come to Algeria, how to submit a dossier to get access to the Algerian archives, which are held, I believe, in the president's office. And those are things I could not have done on my own. There are very few Americans, living and working in Algeria and getting access there. And so thinking about access and affiliation should be an important part of your research plan. Some places like, okay, you want to go work at Kew in the British Archives, you can just kind of plan that you're going to be able to probably go there and get access to varying degrees. But a number of other archives, especially if they're held by political parties or by organizations or in states that have access problems like Israel or Algeria, you have to really think that through early in the process. Okay, Jeff mentioned this stuff, so I'm not going to go through all these as they come up, but I'll just say briefly, in terms of archive access, I just can't stress enough, talking to at least a few academics, political scientists, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, people who have been to the countries that you're going to go to and have worked in the archives that you're going to go to, will save you so much time and give you so much understanding about what's available, who to talk to, how much time you need. Like, those are just gold, those conversations. And so I know that some of us are a little more hesitant to make those connections, but this is not networking in a shallow sense. This is the good sense of talking to people who are working on the same thing that you're interested in and learning from them. And then you're going to pay it forward as well as, Jeffrey and I are maybe doing a little bit today of saying, we've done this stuff. Now, what can we tell you about it? So, again, people are generally very happy to talk to others about archives because, again, it's not that many people who go to these places and really put that time in. So they want to help you. Again, I'm going to mention throughout this little talk some other things you should look at because I can't go through everything, but Terrence Peterson wrote this great piece on War on the Rocks just last year about some of the declassification and reclassification fights that are going on. So one that's near and dear to me with the French archives, because again, I've done a lot of research on Algeria, and I know that Terrence has as well. There are all these national regulations. This is happening with the US too, where politically sensitive documents, say about Algerian counterinsurgency or torture in Algeria, or treatment of the civilian population, like sometimes governments come in and they decide we want to keep this stuff classified, or going to Jeffrey's point about how things are blacked out. These fights are ongoing all the time. And so you want to have a good sense of what the politics are of the archives at the time. This is unfortunately not something that's just being decided by scholars. It's often being decided by politicians. And so this is a great piece that I commend to you to read a little bit about one debate, but he links to many others that are happening with the French archives. I'll also say you should not be overlooking working with your IRB. Now, we all know, and many people will post on Twitter or whatever, oh, like my IRB is such a pain and you had an institutional review board. And to be clear, the IRBs were not created to deal with political science. And so a lot of what they do is deal with natural sciences. And I think they do some things that are problematic in terms of handling political science. But all that being said, on balance, I think the IRB is a net positive because it forces you to think through some of these ethical questions, logistical questions about how you're going to do work. And you might be like, well, I'm not talking to people. So these people, this is not endangering anyone. No, archives are very, very serious things, as we've talked about just now, in terms of access to them or otherwise. I put up this picture. This is a picture that I took on the Falls Road in Belfast. And it was nice to see some school pride there, Boston College. But touts, if you don't know, basically means informants. And so when I was there interviewing people and doing research in the archives in Belfast, there was this whole issue that I don't know if you've heard about, but basically there was this series of recorded interviews that not Boston College academics did, but some people who had been affiliated with the library here who were journalists did. And it became a whole debacle because honestly, they promised anonymity to people that they couldn't necessarily deliver legally when there started to be subpoenas to get access to this supposed oral history archive that wasn't going to be released until people had died. And so it's become, and it will be, this huge case study about not necessarily what to do ethically with doing interviews or working with archives. So working with your IRB about how you're accessing data, how you're going to protect your data. Again, when you're going across international borders, people want to look at your data. They want to grab your stuff. Sometimes you need to be thinking about how you're going to protect this, especially if you're working on sensitive subjects. Again, another piece I'll commend to you, MENA Politics wrote this piece in JPR about the ethics of archival research. So again, don't think that you're doing archival research, ethics don't matter. You want to be conscientiously thinking about this stuff beforehand. I thought this was an excellent piece. Some of you mentioned about working on political violence. I commend this piece to you to read and think about some of these issues, and she links to a lot of other great research on these topics. As I mentioned, protecting your data. This is a picture from Ben Gurion Airport. I, like many people have traveled there, have had the issue of having to empty your whole bags, and maybe I've got books on Middle East politics or whatever else, and you can have these sometimes long encounters about being searched or things of this nature, and obviously depending on your ethnic or religious background, perhaps even more in depth. But you need to think about this stuff in terms of your data and the research you're doing, because again, you're doing political work, even if you don't think that you are. And we know all, unfortunately, some of these cases that are tough about, the Italian academic working in Egypt or some of these other places where, people met untimely ends or faced aggressive acts from regimes because of the work they were doing. So you need to think about protecting your data and protecting the stuff that you're working on. In terms of being in the archives, this is a picture from when I was in the British archive. And you can see I've got kind of maybe the older school technology. I got my DSLR up there. And this was actually great at the time because it's like, hey, I can just sit there, turn the page, click, turn the page, click. Things have advanced now. So going to Jeffrey's point, I think the best thing that I use now is on my cell phone. I have Scanner Pro. You can also use Devon Think, some of these others. Jeffrey mentioned you can actually just even use Google Drive, but the idea of being able to photograph documents that are not available online and have them accessible later is incredibly valuable. You will never be able to just take all the notes you want while you're there. You'll want to go back to stuff again and again. You want to have access to it. And so you will definitely spend some time taking photos of stuff. Now, deciding whether you want to do what I call the vacuum method, which is basically, as Jeffrey was saying, recreate the whole archive versus be a little bit more selective, that's up to you, and it might change depending on the documents you're looking at. But having a plan for how to do this is important. And again, talking to those other academics is helpful because not everyone has to reinvent the wheel, right? I didn't do this as well as I should have, but I mean, how many people are going to the British National Archives looking at some of these similar documents? Maybe they have some of these photos already and they could share with me so I don't have to recreate the same thing, or maybe I can share some of mine thereafter. And again, you have to get into some of the licensing of this stuff, but I think it's something that can be done, and you have those conversations with other academics. What are some of the types of things I found? This was something from the French archives in Aix-en-Provence. This was an incredibly valuable document to me, talking about actions against the French, against civilians, but also against military forces over different periods of time. And so I actually took this document and recreated it like this in my book. And it helped to address one of these key questions I had, right? All I did is I slapped on top of this document, okay, when was the Algerian national movement more fragmented, where they had multiple significant political parties and rebel groups? And when were they more hegemonic, when one group was dominating? I slapped that down in there, and I was like, hey, again, this is correlational. I'm not running an experiment on this. But in a broad sense, when it was fragmented, you saw more violence against civilians, which was in line with my theory, whereas when the movement became more hegemonic, actually the violence against civilians decreased significantly. Now, are there other factors that contribute to that? Yes, and I talk about them in the book, and I read about that in the archives. But again, sometimes you can find documents like this that are really helpful and translate directly to some of the things you're trying to analyze. Or I found documents like this looking at the deployment of forces by the FLN or the ALN, their military force, outside of Algeria and neighboring Tunis and elsewhere. Or in the British National Archives, this is about Zionist organizations and from their intel branch talking about their strength, their armaments over time, which I used to kind of collate group strength. And what I would do over time is I would be able to create, things like this. This is a stylized version, but I have the data behind it. This is looking at the Palestinian national movement, looking at the relative strength of these different factions over time, which again allows me to more directly test, okay, well, I'm predicting when this group is weaker and this one's stronger, they're going to restrain violence, they're going to escalate violence. Or in this period, when it's fragmented versus when it's hegemonic, it's going to be more likely to be successful here than here. And so again, I use the archives to kind of build up and create, we can call it data, whatever you want to call it, to be able to do this type of analysis. Things like this in Centre, the center in Algeria, Centre d'études maghrébines Algérie, or in the Zionist archives, finding stuff about some of the Zionist parties and the electoral races that they were having in the days before the founding of Israel. So all this stuff is great. And as Jeffrey mentioned, again, archive stuff can be fun too, right? So this was a document I found about a dispatch, and it said, it was chronicling a telephone call, and it said, call proved impossible to trace, voice described as that of, quote, typical screen villain. Very clipped accent. So it's just kind of like, sometimes you come across stuff that's interesting. Lindsay O'Rourke, who's a colleague of mine in Boston College, just wrote a chapter in our edited volume about fieldwork where she talked about the doodles in the archive. So she was finding all these doodles by President Eisenhower, in the aftermath of like raids in Guatemala, where he's like drawing himself looking like this buff guy next to these ships, but like the insights that gave to his mindset at the time. So again, archives are not always kind of just these stale documents you're leafing through. It can give insights, and they can be alive in terms of how people are thinking at the time. And as I mentioned before, you can access sometimes other people's stuff. So this is a picture of Bill Quant's field notes from interviewing Ferhat Abbas. And if you know anything about the Algerian national movement, Ferhat Abbas is one of the most important individuals who was involved with it. He obviously had passed away by the time that I did my field research in Algeria, but Bill Quant was there just 5 years after Algerian independence talking to him. And this was incredibly valuable to me beyond just the secondary source literature that I saw. So that was great in terms of that project. As I mentioned before, when you go to the archives, don't always assume that what you're doing is simply, I've got these pieces of information I'm looking for. Now that matters, right? As Mark Trachtenberg taught me, you want to think about what are the observable implications of any theory or hypothesis, which basically means, how would I know this thing when I saw it? How would I know this phenomenon or this mechanism when I saw it? And you come up with a list of all of these pieces of evidence you could hypothetically find. And that's great because that keeps your antenna up for looking for that information. But as Jeffrey noted, that can also bias you towards looking and triaging certain documents versus others, and also close your mind off to different ways of conceptualizing the issue you're looking at or the questions you're looking at. So these kind of unknown unknowns, you should be open to that as well as you're doing archival work. So to close, I just want to say a couple final points for this. Sometimes people think about, how can we actually display archival research? Because again, this is part of it too. When you're trying to go on the job market, as I know many of you are going to do, you might be like, oh my gosh, people who are doing field experiments, statistical stuff, they have all of these great tables that play really well and capture a lot of information in a small space. And, job committees are really impressed by that. How can I actually present archival work in an interesting way? Now, one is, I'll commend to you the earlier APSA MENA panel on, text analysis and whatnot, because that's, one way you can do it. But another way that I found, I actually went back, and it's somewhat embarrassing because again, it's not nearly as good as I would like it to be, but I went back to my job talk I gave at BC, like 8 or 9 years ago, and I pulled a couple slides that I used from it. And, these are some of the ways that I used archival documents in my talk. I basically took this document I had gotten from the Institute for Palestine Studies in Beirut, which was a Fatah pamphlet that basically talked about why they decided to launch armed struggle in January 1st of 1965, when they became kind of the first Palestinian faction to launch violence against the Israelis, when some of the stronger groups were kind of working with Nasser and trying to actually hold off on some escalatory violence. And so this was a way for me, amidst my broader discussion of the historical developments of the case, to kind of visually represent, okay, here's this document I worked from. Again, most people in the audience aren't reading Arabic, and so I'm having a translation of it there, but it's a way to kind of project that. And I did that again with a document from the PFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, talking about their decision to shift towards a different type of violent strategy using hijacking in the late 1960s from, again, some of their documents. So I think this is important to think about some of these ways as well, not just about how we write and document and use archival work, but also how we can explain it to an audience that doesn't exactly necessarily see what's the value of this, or how does this actually correlate up to our analyses. And again, these are just pull quotes. This is obviously not the core of what one is doing as an archivist or someone working the archives, but just some ways I thought about as interesting to kind of display this stuff. And at the end of the day, if you look at the article I published that came out of this project, which is in international security, like this table is entirely based on years of archival work and interviews, where I was able to document the relative strength of these different groups over time, as well as, this is just me kind of summarizing, but in the article I go through all their various decision points and the actions they used of using violence, of not, of negotiating with the French government or not. And so all of this is the basis, or based on archival research. So just in terms of resources, I wanted to name a couple. I mentioned this book before. Ora Sekeli and I edited it. It's got about 44 different political scientists who are part of it, but many Middle East, it's actually disproportionately Middle East scholars. So we have people who have done extensive archival work like Mark Trachtenberg and Lindsay O'Rourke who write in it, but also we have Carla Abdel Katsipis writing about research in Lebanon, Nadia Haj about research in Palestine, Ian Lustig about a bunch of places, Amani Jamal, Mark Lynch, Wendy Perlman. So the purpose of this, kind of similar to this talk today, is to provide accessible stories about research you've done, the ethical challenges of it, how to actually carry this stuff out. So I commend that to you. And I also commend, these are a bunch of links here for different either libraries, going to Jeffrey's point from before, or there's a bunch of good resources online. There's this new digital fieldwork website run by a bunch of people at Georgetown that they're trying to build. There's a bunch of others, as Jeffrey mentioned, at Wilson Center. So again, there's many more of these, but all of these websites have multiple archives throughout the region and talking about accessing them both digitally and in person. And so I'll include those for the slides, and so people can check those out later as well. Okay, so with that, I will stop. And if questions come up, I'm happy to field them. And otherwise, Jeffrey, maybe I don't know if you want to make a couple of points on that, or we want to do Q&A right now and then go to yours, either way.
No, I think this is great, spot on. So what I'm going to do to give people some time to think, because I think we can hit the ground running towards the end and consolidate the questions if you want, Peter, and be able to talk more about them. I just have a few slides very briefly to talk about my train of thought as well, and maybe that would allow for more sort of more questions and more reflections. So I'm just going to share screen for a moment, and then we can open up more for the Q&A. So this is going to be very brief in comparison to what Peter extensively covered. This is a great job, Peter. Thank you so much, because I remember witnessing some parts of your process, right? When you were a postdoc at Crown, and you were talking about this and finishing your first book and making these decisions on what to keep, because in reality, we end up like the table that Peter showed in a while ago is basically a table that, as he mentioned, it's a small reflection of thousands of pages of work, meticulous connecting the dots between different events, sequences, groups, actors, in order to show that final neat result. So the neatness that Peter demonstrated is not one that you can find at the archives. You end up like, there's just an example from one of the first personal photographs that I had from Maryland. And that was one batch on one day. And that consisted of, if I'm not mistaken, about 24 boxes. As you can see, there's my name there. But that was like 24 boxes. And out of these 24 boxes, I actually used maybe 1 or 2 pages for what I'm doing right now. And that's 24 boxes of documents. So the neat part that Peter demonstrated right now should not come as a result of one book, one article, but it's really thousands of pages. So I'll just give you a quick example before we go to the Q&A. So this is an example from my book manuscript and my research on US intelligence and foreign policy in the Middle East, specifically during moments that are revolutionary. So in reality, who are my actors, right? State Department officials, CIA, National Security Council, presidential papers, interview transcripts, memoirs, and archival sources and secondary documents in the MENA. So this seems like a full plate, and it is a full plate. But in reality, can I ever do justice by looking at all these units and all their papers? Bearing in mind what Peter mentioned earlier on, that in some cases, the documents might be next to your home, exactly next to your home. So I remember when I was living in Boston, Harvard basically had tons of documents on reports and papers that were written during the Kennedy administration, the Eisenhower administration, that were stored at Lamont Library on microfilm, just to give you an example. So that saved me the trip from going up to DC. But in reality, that also brought another layer of guilt, which is I know they're there. I know these 18 microfilms are there. And right now I can't really avoid that I don't have access to them because it's one bus ride away or walking distance from where I was living when I was working and residing in Boston and Cambridge. Just to give you an example, like this is a very neat way of saying, how can I really understand and study US intelligence and foreign policy during times of revolution? And these are some of the most important actors. To give you an example from a book that came out that I edited in September 2020, my original thinking, just to give you what Peter was mentioning regarding embracing archival documents, not running away from them. And this is exactly my train of thought when I was doing this book with authors and scholars that have been working, that are historians, political scientists, and sociologists, right? So the original thinking behind this project was that revolutionary processes were only important and transformative for states in the MENA. So we began from that based on existing literature. We read the existing literature, and it seemed that the moment in 1958, which is a very important moment in the history of the modern Middle East, was really important for states in the region, right? If you haven't done any archival research, you haven't pushed really the limits of what's available in secondary accounts, you won't get to the conclusion that we're able to come and refine our existing thoughts. And this is what I do in my own chapter in the actual book, which is in reality, this is going to seem like a very easy process, but the deep archival research led me to refine my existing original mindset, which is that revolutionary processes were equally transformative for foreign powers, including the US and others. This very small qualifier, what makes it revolutionary for the US and for Britain and for France at that point in time, was not easily found in secondary accounts. So the more I was digging into Eisenhower's records, into State Department files, into CIA files, it gave me another story of the recalibration of US grand strategy, the shift in coming to terms with what is really a nuanced version of the Anglo-American special relationship. It's not one that was really divided only based on Cold War dynamics. It wasn't East versus West or America versus Soviet Union. There's a lot of gray area and a lot of nuance in the middle that pointed to American dissatisfaction with British policies and French policies, whether it's France and Algeria, whether it's Britain and Egypt and Suez, whether it's America and Jordan. But these dynamics were nowhere to be found if one had not done the actual empirical, the actual archival research. And that also pushed me to really refocus and recenter the intention on Suez, what Suez meant in terms of a crisis, in terms of a war for that moment in 58. So the refined conclusion coming out of that book was that when we think about revolutions, we have to move beyond the binary of success or failure, and also move away from the binary that this was only important for Abdel Nasser or for Jordan or for Syria, or what happened with the coups in 1956 or the coups in Jordan in 1957, or the revolutionary moment in Lebanon in 1958. That in reality, this was a moment where France and Britain had to come to terms with their decline in power, and America had to come to terms with the idea that even as the dominant Western patron in the Middle East, this new led order was not easy to sustain. So this is something that when we think about IR, right, we just adopt a perspective of great powers versus small powers. But in reality, once we dig deeper into the archives, I was able to retrace the role of local actors and their influence on decision-making processes and circles. And I got into these archives that Pierre was mentioning, where a telephone conversation occurring on a Sunday afternoon between the Lebanon's foreign minister at that point in time, Sharm Malik, and President Eisenhower, right? On a Sunday afternoon, that conversation happening between the Lebanese diplomat and an American president is not something you're going to find in secondary account. But I was able to find the transcript, what they discussed, and it had some fun aspects that Peter was mentioning, that President Eisenhower was asleep between this hour and that hour. He's going to have his tea at this hour, and then he had this conversation. You can go into those details, but the most important part of it was that the foreign minister of Lebanon at that point in time had a somewhat direct line to the President of the United States of America. And that's something that I was able to basically come up with once I was doing the archival research. And another example from an article that I published, and it got awarded the best article in Intelligence and National Security in 2017, 2018, also began with the idea on intelligence, right? It began with the idea that if I'm thinking about the American intelligence failure, everyone's talking about the intelligence failure in Iraq in 2003. And I said, well, obviously there should be a longer history for this. So when I started doing secondary reading, it all focused on the idea of analysis. And there are so many great names out there that I can mention right now, we can talk more about, that focus on issues of analysis, whether it's political psychologists. Here we can talk about Bob Jervis, Rose McDermott. We can go on and on. There are tons of people that we can talk about. But the emphasis when we think about intelligence really has to do with the idea of cognitive bias, mirror imaging, or groupthink on the level of analysis. The problem in intelligence failures really has to do with the idea of analysis. There's a mismatch between how we think about estimates and how we think about reality. But when I started doing the archival work, it became clear that that is only one part of the actual answer, the bigger argument. The bigger argument really had to do with what Jervis later wrote about in his book, Why Intelligence Fails, that came out in 2010 about Iran, was that in Iraq, there's a similar case here where the intelligence failure was primarily rooted in poor collection methods. But that's something that I could not pick up on in secondary accounts. Once I did the primary research, and this is, I'm talking about memoirs, I'm talking about CIA records, I'm talking about State Department files, I'm talking here about oral histories and interviews with diplomats that are hosted by the Library of Congress, right? I looked up at these documents and realized that everyone was talking about the fact that American officials basically stationed in Baghdad and Kirkuk had a very, very, very weak relationship with any members or any human source of intelligence outside the regime circles. But that's something that was not obvious, right, in existing scholarship, that they lacked access to a circle that is across the political spectrum. So they had no informants in the in the Iraqi Communist Party, no informants in different opposition movements, no informants in underground movements, and even their relationships with military officers were based on a certain grade. So they didn't have a good relationship with junior officers. And junior officers, if you know really about civil military relations, you know for a fact that junior officers are the key group, not the only group, but the key group to understand the possibilities of when a coup might happen or not. So the archives pushed me to know that in reality, it's not that those before me were wrong, but it's just those before me were doing an incomplete argument. They were providing an incomplete theory, if you want, on the basis for why we have that intelligence failure. So the refined conclusion based on archival research, based on mining the data, pushed me to further qualify the argument that says, in reality, if you want to think about failure at that moment in time, I have to take this two-step process. I have to look at the level of collection and the level of analysis. And this is something that was mirrored in what Jervis discusses regarding the collapse of the Shah and the revolutionary moment in Iran in the late 70s, right? That was Savak's focus on maintaining relationships only and primarily with American officials that was such a big blind spot for American officials because they knew nothing outside of Savak. They had no interest whatsoever in Islamist movements, leftist movements, or opposition movements. And this is really mirroring what I was able to come up with and be able to find in terms of archival support for the argument on how we can understand a refined conclusion on the sources of misperception and the sources of failure when we think about America and Iraq in the late 1950s. So just a few reflections on these examples before we go to the Q&A. Without archival research, at least from my own work, it would have been impossible to understand the interaction between various US officials. This is not an equal playing field, but archival research demonstrates how many documents don't end up being read or received by policymakers. Because if you look at the Eisenhower special files, for example, that is a copy of the documents that he actually saw and signed, and not others that have actually used his name or someone in his office that actually had read them or not. The discord and harmony cannot be recreated but by looking at the actual source. No one in hindsight is going to tell you, well, I wasn't happy with the president, or I wasn't happy with the foreign secretary, I wasn't happy with the CIA director, but that discord and harmony is visible in the pushback and diplomatic cables, consular dispatches, and reports being written in the field. And the bigger question for my work is, well, to what extent can we think about intelligence or lack thereof having an influence in foreign policy? Does it have any impact? Do we pay billions of dollars every year for a defense budget and the CIA budget? In reality, are they doing anything when it comes to foreign policy? Are they really helping diplomats and policymakers do better decisions? If I say yes, I need to back that up. And to back up that assertion, I really had to connect the dots between to what extent were intelligence estimates being really used and being heeded by policymakers. And another important part of this reflection really has to do with the interpretations of US officials in real time. I don't really care in hindsight if everything becomes clear, right? We're all biased of hindsight clarity and hindsight bias. We knew that the regime in Iran was unstable. We knew that Mubarak was going to be kicked out. These are sentimental phrases that you can see very vividly in op-eds, but I really wanted to look at the record in real time as it was unfolding. So what were the reports that were being written before 1958, before 1963, before the war in 1973, before the invasion of Lebanon by Israelis in 1982, before the beginning of the Civil War in 1975? To what extent were people talking about the actual possibility of a skirmish, right? Will the FLN win? Going back to Peter's examples, like how can you think about the FLN winning? What were we writing during the Algerian War of Independence in reality? Strategies, tactics. And another important part here is that to unpack the decision-making processes and the different units that have weight, right? Is it lobbies? Is it oil cartels? Or are we really talking about one person running the show? What does it mean to have two brothers in some of the highest positions in America, the Dulles brothers, for example? what are the implications of having the Secretary of State and the DCI both be from the same family? Does that in any shape or form impact decision making? And for our purposes, and what I do, because as Peter mentioned, I didn't just want to write a book or publish articles that are going to focus only from an Anglo-American perspective, was really trying to bring to the table and bring to the fore the discussion of interactions between Anglo-American officials and Arab political actors. So everything that I did on the Western side of the pond, if you want, had to be to a certain extent recreated in different capitals and cities and towns in the Middle East. I can't write about Jordan or about Syria or about Egypt or about Lebanon in the period I'm looking at during the Cold War without saying, well, to what extent did these actors also have an influence on US decision making? Because at the end of the day, these are the sources of information that are being consulted by American officials that are in the field, right? These are their sources of information, whether they're underground movements, whether they're open sources, whether they're closed sources, whether they're informants. But at the end of the day, it's important to understand to what extent is there an alternative understanding that we can think of when we look at decision-making processes happening in Washington, but in reality having roots to a large extent in many capitals across the Middle East. And this has led me to really consider and be able to reframe how we think about agency, right? And Peter mentioned the agency of the FLN, the agency of different Palestinian national movements. And what does that mean in terms of thinking about the success or failure of being able to create a state or not? And in my case, to what extent did that impact how American officials perceive the limits of their foreign policy decisions when it relates to oil, when it relates to supporting regimes, when it relates to extending foreign aid? And that will not be a complete explanation if I'm not able to trace who these individuals are, what are they doing, and why are their names mentioned in tons and tons and tons of documents. What does it mean to think about the meetings, for example, between King Hassan of Jordan and different CIA officials, right? That's not something just to phantom over and just say, well, there's nothing behind these meetings. Or relationships between CIA officers in Lebanon and getting funding from different institutions to instigate and support the coup that failed and occurred in Syria in 1956, for example. If I look at it from one perspective, it's just going to look like a coup that failed and America did not have enough information, or the CIA failed to support the right group in order to stage that coup successfully. But if you take a step back and you look at the other side of the argument, the other side of these documents, you dig deeper and you realize that many Syrian officials for 2 months, basically using different radio channels, were mentioning that a coup is going to happen. And we know this is supported by the West. We know this is supported by the Americans, and we're going to foil it. And that's why on August 12th, this was announced on different Syrian broadcast channels. And I'm talking here about August 12, 1956, right? It was announced that, look, in reality, we know this was going to happen, and we're going to arrest everyone that was involved in this. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope you have questions and things that we can talk about. Peter and I are looking forward to chatting. Thank you, everyone.
So if you have questions, comments on anything, please just raise your hand electronically. I see, well, those are hands clapping. That's nice, but we'd love to have questions as well. So please raise your hand. We'd love to engage with some of you. Love to hear your thoughts. Yep, you can type if you like. That's just fine. Okay, people want to type, that's fine. I do with archives language, might be able to read very well. Do you have them translate? Okay, so Sean asked the question about how do you deal with archives you might be able to read very well. Do you have them translated? So I can speak on this. So I can read French pretty well. I can read Arabic quite well. I feel like a little less well these days, although I'm still reading my Arabic pretty regularly. But when you're in the middle of it, doing it for years, you know, I'm not fluent in Arabic, but my Fusha is pretty good. My reading's pretty good. And then English, obviously, I can read. So, you know, and then Hebrew, I cannot read. So basically, I have a language I can read fluently, a language I can read close to fluently, a language I can read pretty well, and a language I can't read. And so here's how I did it. I did all of my archival work in Arabic, you know, just by myself, in French, pretty much by myself, but I actually had a research assistant. Even though I could read it, I happened to have a BC student who was based in Aix-en-Provence who was helping to coordinate with me to look at some more documents, and so that was helpful. And then in Hebrew, I could not read Hebrew. And so I did hire an RA to help me go through some of the Hebrew documents. And I obviously was not able to go as in depth for some of those things. At the same time, a lot of the documents for the various Zionist groups were in English. And that was actually a decision I had made somewhat with language. I would love it if I speak fluent Hebrew, fluent Arabic, etc. But doing research on Israel, Palestine, and some of these areas, there's many more Arabic speakers than Hebrew speakers. So that's one of the reasons I decided to opt to study Arabic throughout grad school and thereafter, because I felt like in Israel, obviously, ideally, you would love to be able to speak and read Hebrew. And I hope that that's still a goal for me in the longer term. But for the moment, and when I was doing this project, I was not able to. And so I think to do, honestly, really good in-depth archival research, I think being able to read the language is a pretty strong necessity. So I wouldn't have made deep Hebrew reading of archives a core part of my research unless I spoke the language. But I was comfortable doing French and Arabic archives because of my language skills. I don't know what your answers and thoughts are on that, Jeffrey.
So Sean, this is wonderful, but I think you're asking two questions. And the first question I would say, having them translated you might end up having a loss in translation kind of argument. And you know what I mean by that? There are some terms that cannot be equally translated. So my advice is that if you can keep the actual record, if you're collecting them and be able to say what Peter was mentioning, getting well-versed in language and not to miss out on these nuances would be great. In terms of collection, this also varies, right? I'm worried if I don't know, I don't have access to a language and I really need it. I'm always worried about how to delegate, right? It's fine, it works. But there's also an argument here that you're not making the final decision making when it comes to what should be collected and what should not be collected. So I'll be basically, to a certain extent, even if the language you're not completely comfortable with it, you can collect, you can get the support of someone. And then once you have the collection, that's where you can decide based on keywords, buzzwords that might matter to you, key dates, to really dig through and find a nuanced translation that's not only a literal one. And I've had this discussion with many colleagues in America, which is, well, is it just translation or is it really the cultural sensitivities that go into translation? Certain jokes or certain smirks or certain comments that might be part of why the document is interesting to deconstruct and talk about. That's how I would say it, at least.
A couple of the questions there. I don't know if you want to take it. It's some of the chat, and I saw it. So let's go to some of the chat here, and then Sean, we'll go to your hand in a minute because we addressed some of your questions. Software to, yeah. So that going, yeah. So there's a couple. So I've used Scanner Pro. Some people use DevonThink. Some people use Fine Reader. Some of these are varying degrees of expense as well. But if you're going to do archival work, having something where you can take a photo, like Scanner Pro, you takes a photo, immediately creates a PDF of that document for me, and then does OCR searching. To me, that's just invaluable. And it also will link directly to Dropbox, so it can put in directly into the folders that I'm using. I wish I had that when I was in grad school. I did not have that. I was doing my DSLR and then myself naming the documents. So it's become a lot better over the past decade or two. I don't know technology, what you would say, Jeffrey, but that's what I would say on that point.
I use Scannable and it's great. In terms of direct storage, at some point when I upgraded my iPhone, the resolution was great. I was taking photos, actual photos. And because of iCloud, I bought the storage plan on iCloud, which is huge. I knew that in real time, these pictures were being. So at some point, I wavered between Scannable to do the PDF and just taking actual images that I know for a fact are being stored. If my phone dies, they're still there, and I have my iPad with me as the backup, and I have power banks as the backup. So I would say you can begin with a cheap option, and then, as Peter was saying, upgrade as you move forward. To what extent do you want to save time? You want to do them immediately PDFs? You want to throw them immediately on Dropbox? But there is these hidden costs that one should keep in mind, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll say on Scanner Pro, I think it cost me $3 or $5. So some of these are more expensive, but that's an app that's not that crazy expensive. And linking to Rosalie's question about storage, for me, I think never assume that you're going to remember where a document comes from. So obviously, as maybe you probably know, to properly cite archival documents, you often have to have the box number, all these various things. So what I do is I simply have labeled my various Dropbox folders for a given box. You have all that stuff in there. And then when I'm scanning it, it can kind of go right into the document. And then either after I go through a given box earlier that day, if I'm adding any additional descriptors to the title or things like that, I do that. So it sounds a little annoying, but I don't think you necessarily have to if you're doing the vacuum method, you don't necessarily have to read everything in that moment, but
Yeah.
correctly organizing it and labeling it in that moment is essential, because otherwise you're going to spend a lot more time later having to relocate stuff. Jeff, I don't know if you're going to say something about that. I got a question to another one.
Can you discuss the use of leaked documents and what are some criteria? So leaked documents is very problematic on some levels, right? For instance, there was a big pushback in the academic community about whether one can use WikiLeaks or not, right? Are you pushing ethical boundaries? I remember when I was teaching at BU, some students that were military cadets, if I'm going to discuss something regarding WikiLeaks, they can't be physically present in class, because this is basically, it's a no-no to a certain extent. I don't know if that's what you mean by leaked documents, but I would be very cautious in what I mean by leaked, in terms of someone giving you documents that you cannot certify, or you cannot really know that they're legitimate, right? Or leaked documents that might be shady in a way where, I don't know, like several times at the archives, I came across documents that should be withdrawn. And maybe I'm too kind, I don't know, but I usually in that moment, because I want to maintain access, I would go up to the person and say, well, I don't think I really should be seeing these documents, right? So that's what's written on the file. Some people recreate these documents and they share them on social media, and they say, well, it's not my fault that they're there. It's someone's bureaucratic job. They forgot to do that. That's the point on leaking. Commonly used to evaluate the quality of archival sources, I would say citations is very important, recreating what people have done before you, where it's located in reality. If you're reading about KGB archives in some, I don't know, it's not a institutional setting, but someone's telling you these are KGB archives, or Stasi archives, or CIA records, like CIA has its own housing rules. So if you want to work on CIA records, they're going to be at the National Archives, or they're going to be online in the FOIA electronic reading room. If someone hosts a website that says these are also CIA records, I'll be cautious, for example, about that. Peter, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this leaked documents and the idea of ensuring quality.
Yeah. So I'd say this, the most classic thing people will talk about with, like WikiLeaks or things like that, I don't know if you're referring to that, is like, hey, academics have made use of those. If you want to potentially have a job in the government, I would probably stay away from them. But I will secondly say, leaks is not just that. I think about the Rukmini Callimachi, issue with, potentially taking archival documents from Iraq, and then the whole hullabaloo about that, or returning them or otherwise. I think that that's an important thing to think about too, is just, not just, oh, it's leaked, should I use it or not? But, who kind of owns these documents and who has access to them and where they're being held. Again, like, I think when people work in the archives, they think about it as not always being involved in politics the same way that talking to people directly is, but I think that it is. And I think as scholars of the Middle East, we have to think about that stuff. So I would not just think about, career prospects and whatnot, but I would also think about, like, why is this being leaked? Who's leaking this? How reliable is this? And, kind of where do I stand on that stuff? I think that that's important. We can keep, okay. Yeah, there's many more here. Maybe we
just very quickly.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Peter, just very quickly to Sean regarding the OCR thing, and Sean, you can raise your hand. But if I'm not mistaken, and I know Rich Nielsen did this extensively, and he's using software for Arabic transcripts and letters and interviews. So I think there is a way around it. I know OCR for a fact, like the Adobe version of it, they have not done a good Arabic update, or there isn't a good Arabic patch, but I know that there are alternatives right now. I haven't used them personally because I can read the text fluently, but to a large extent, I would like to hear other experiences from people here. And Peter, you can share, and others, to what extent is it doable to think about OCR and replicate the same English, French, etc. Kind of languages in Arabic? And I think it's very difficult, to be quite honest. That's how I see it myself. I don't know if there are any thoughts on that.
Yeah, if I might, sorry to interrupt, Peter. I would just say that some of the people working kind of in the field of digital Islamic humanities have been working on this a lot. So there's like Maxim Romanov, for example. He's very teched up in this field, and he's been kind of experimenting. And I think the latest kind of statistics that I saw was that it was 99% accurate, which means that 1 out of every 100 characters is off, which, when you hear that number, it sounds really great. But then when you realize how many characters there are on the page, you realize that it's actually kind of a problem, especially when you're working on kind of large corpuses and, especially any kind of word search and that sort of thing. And if you guys don't mind, I just wanted to kind of go back to the question of languages that we maybe don't master. So my own work, I've done a lot of kind of Arabic and French and English interviews, but I also work on Armenian communities, and I've been wanting to kind of supplement the work that I've done in field research with kind of archival research. So looking at Hagazian, they have a lot of, Lebanon has a lot of Armenian language press. And my problem has been not access. Everyone there is great, and they're really happy to have people come and work there. They have a wonderful collection. But it's that because the Armenian alphabet is still totally foreign to me, and I just don't read Armenian at all. I worry about having kind of outsourcing, even if it's with an RA that I'm working with very closely, having someone else kind of making the decisions about what's important and what's not, and not being able to kind of adapt to the archive, because it's very much an iterative process in my experience, in the sense that you go in there and like, you guys were both saying, you have these ideas about what's going to be important and what you're looking for, but then you realize, actually, there are these other things, and this is something that I hadn't really, considered before, but this is quite important. And I worry about not just kind of missing out on that if I'm kind of giving instructions to someone else. And so short of going to Yerevan for the summer and trying to at least get some basic literacy in Armenian, I was wondering if you guys have any kind of other solutions that you've thought about for this.
I don't know if it's a solution, but how I handled this was to say, okay, my experience with Hebrew language documents will be different than the others. And so that's why, for example, in my talk, I showed the election results. And it's like, okay, I feel comfortable with a table like this, being able to analyze the various Zionist parties and their election outcomes. Whereas I don't feel comfortable, as I do with French or Arabic documents, reading through some personal account and feeling like I have a strong understanding of what's going on. So I totally co-sign what you're saying. And I would generally, as I say, not undertake any project that I didn't have a strong grasp of the language in to do extensive archival research. Because again, even gathering, quote unquote data, knowing exactly where this is coming from or what it's not always an easy thing to do. So in that case, I felt comfortable with it because a lot of the archives I was working in had significant English language and Hebrew language stuff. I had a very good understanding of the case, and I had an RA there with me to be able to help me to find the particular things I wanted. But I wouldn't have been able to do that, nor would I have done that, say, in Algeria, where the documents are French and Arabic. And if I didn't speak those languages, I would not have done the archival research for the reasons you mentioned.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly to this. I agree with you, Peter. And Sean, I don't know to what extent one could say this, but how important is it is also a matter of choice when it comes to your investment, right? That, like, if you want to do that or not, when it comes to spending the time, not only relying on RA, but also knowing to what extent is that going to change your entire analysis, or it's going to contribute in a way that this is going to be such an important contribution that you're going to know it's going to haunt you from now to the end of time, that this exists, it's going to be important, you need this storyline, and you're not going to actually put it in. Because that's also a hidden cost that we all face, right? Even if you're fluent in Arabic, even if you're fluent in French or in English or whatever, there's always going to be some kind of time constraint or time consideration that one wants to take into account. So if you're going to say, I'm going to invest 3 months to be able to get basic literacy, and then get the documents, and then you realize, well, there's nothing really for you as a smoking gun, right? Something that's really going to change the entire thinking, then that's something I can't really see this, but that decision where maybe you can do like a soft exploration, maybe hire someone, choose a few documents to the extent that you can, and be able to see whether there is something that is available before you take that step and get basic literacy. Like I would try to test grounds, if you want, to the extent that you can. I don't know. That's how I would do it if I want to, like, if I write something right now about the KGB during the Cold War and I don't know Russian, to a certain extent, I would assume that I would like to at least get a vibe of what they have about the Middle East, and maybe get 10 pages translated, and then see if I really need to do the next step. That's how I would go about it. For instance, if I want to write about something related to CIA, KGB, MI6, and that relationship maybe in Eastern Germany at some point during the Cold War, I would want to do that small investment, but not the bigger one at this point, at least. That's how I see it.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, going back to points that Jeffrey and I brought up before, again, talking and reading people who have done research in these archives and all this stuff is invaluable, because I think that can give you a sense, going to Sean's point, what I would ask myself is what's out there and what am I not getting by not being able to access these documents? And of course, there are things that even those people haven't discovered, but talking to people who maybe, would read this particular language or have been in those archives, you can say, okay, what am I missing if I'm not doing X? Because at the end of the day, we're mostly not doing a lot of things, right? We're not all interviewing everyone, running field experiments and everything, doing archives. So you're making discrete choices, even if you don't think that you are, about what you're accessing and not accessing. And so I think you can get some sense of what's in an archive or what's in these things from talking to people who have done that, and then make a judgment about how valuable it is for you to acquire that next language or to be able to do that stuff, or can you get shallow bits of data or otherwise. Like again, I can read Hebrew letters. I just don't have the vocabulary to feel confident reading a narrative thing. So I think you got to adjust based on your skills or decide to improve your skills.
So there's one question from Amal. When studying graffiti and visual archives, what are the most prominent archives about Egypt from the 19th till now? I can't speak for specifics in the area of graffiti and visual archives. So I don't know, Peter, if you have any thoughts on that, or maybe Sean, I know you're there. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share, but I don't have anything in particular about archives that really tackle the idea of studying graffiti, political art, and other visual archives. I know at museums, many museums host sections and exhibits, and I know many have been happening between Lebanon and Jordan in the last year or so, but even during COVID, some of these were happening online. But in terms of the particularity of Egypt, I'm not really sure. Peter, you have any thoughts on that?
No, I was going to say, when we got to that question, I'm just not an expert on political graffiti of Egypt. I've studied political graffiti in Northern Ireland and some other places. As you saw, I had an example of political graffiti from my own time there, but I don't know those sources, so I apologize. We should probably, though, wrap, Jeffrey. So I don't know if you want to take a minute or two and say any final points just to kind of wrap things up. But yeah, this has been a great session.
Great. I think this has been great, and I really learned a lot by just talking about this and getting some of these questions, to be quite honest. And it's really nice to engage with you, Peter. Thanks again to Andrew. Thanks to Lara for really hosting this and making this possible. And again, this is an open conversation. So at any point, I think we'll be able to host another session or a similar session. We'll also let you know. But I don't have anything but to say happy hunting. Be brave about it. In reality, there will be ups and downs. You're not going to find all the answers on your first trip. Maybe you don't really have to do a trip in reality. If we're thinking about COVID-19 right now, there are a lot of stuff out there, lots of digital stuff that you can use. But again, I just want to mention this because Peter and I have this relationship already. I've sought Peter's advice so many times, all right? And Peter is always very supportive. So what I mean by that is that don't put these inhibitions in a way where I'm not going to contact another scholar or a senior scholar. Maybe they're not going to help. In reality, just do it. Like, get it out of your system, send out the email. It might help you in many, many different ways. And I've tried it and it worked. It's not always successful, but 9 out of 10 times people will share documents, will give you leads, or even make introductions. And this is how you can really make good use of your time. So happy hunting. I hope this was beneficial, and I hope you really, I wish you well in future trips. Thank you so much.
Co-sign. And yeah, having a great relationship with Jeffrey has been wonderful. I've learned from you just as much as vice versa. I don't think of us as senior or junior. I think we're the same generation, being at Crown and otherwise. But yeah, building those networks is really important. And I will say again, political science has a growing and robust discourse on archive and archival research, but it still pales in comparison to the historical debates and discussions on these things. So if you're going to work in the archives, read stuff in history as well, read historians talk about these things, all of these issues from logistical to ethical to building networks to finding what's available. Like, these discussions are out there. So hopefully Jeffrey and I were able to give you some insights into this stuff today, but there's a ton out there. We both suggested, and we'll post a lot of those articles and things that I suggested. Other people have written on this, but check them out. And yeah, we remain as a resource to you. So you can definitely drop me or Jeffrey a line going forward. We hope to meet you at APSA virtually or hopefully in person soon. And thank you to Andrew and APSA for putting this on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter and Jeffrey. So appreciate your guidance of this discussion today. And thanks for everyone for joining. We do have one more final session in the APSA MENA Methods series. That'll be on Thursday at 10 a.m. US Eastern. And that's going to be talking about fieldwork a little bit more broadly. But thank you, everyone, and please stay in touch with APSA and APSA MENA. Cheers.